take a look at creating our first working environment where we can start coding and building stuff. So first, we'll create a Spring Boot web application running locally on our machine, and then we'll host it on Heroku and also push it off to a GitHub repository, right? And I'll share the repository with you on Piazza so that you can follow along any source code that we've worked on in class. All right, so first we'll be creating the Spring application. Here's a command line to get you going. Again, this assumes that you've already installed the Spring CLI. Right? So let's work on that. Okay, let's see, where are we? All right, so let's see. We're in summer 2. We're in the right place, 2018. Let's go into lectures, and let's create our first project. Can you see that? And let's see. I would ask you to follow a naming convention for your projects. So that maybe start off with webdev, then the semester, so it might be summer 2, 2018, and then the role. What is this? This will be the Java server. So this will be server, and there'll be 2 servers. There'll be a Java server and there'll be a Node.js server, right? A little later, but for right now there's going to be a Java server. So I'm just going to give this Java, and then at the end I'll just give it the name. A unique identifier, right? Maybe my username. So that's it. So it created that, and it's right there. If we go in there, it's a Java project. Notice that it has a pom.xml file. That means that this is a Maven project, right? That it has some dependencies. We can open it up with our favorite IDE. I'll open it up with STS. But if you prefer with IntelliJ or even a text editor, that's fine. Close all this. All right, so we can import. Say, let's see, import, and we're going to import an existing Maven project, and it's under, let's see, let's browse. So it's under Janunzi, webdev, 2018, summer 2, lectures. There it is. This is the one we just created. We'll say finish. And all right, so it parsed it. Now the only part of interest here, a couple things. Let's see, we have the POM file. This is our dependencies, right? This declares that this is a Spring Boot application that is being packaged as a jar file, right? That it's right. So this is it's a web project. It's a Spring Boot web project. Even though it's a web project, notice that it doesn't have in the source, it doesn't have anywhere for us to put any index files or any HTML content. Right? So we'll need to do that. And the standard name for the public directory where we host any public content is web app. So we'll create that. We'll create a directory called web app. That's a standard name. Right? And any HTML content that we drop in there will be publicly available to anybody who visits our website. Okay? So let's start with something simple. We'll create here an index file. We'll say index. That just says H1, welcome to webdev. webdev summer 2, 2018. Okay, all right. So that's what we have. Now from the command line, once you're in the directory, once you are in, you have to be in the directory. You can compile the source code. Again, if you're doing it from the command line, you can also do it from the IDE. Right? But I'm going to do it from the command line. You know, if you're not using an IDE, you can do it right from the command line. So you can do Maven clean install. So this will parse the POM file, and we'll see all the dependencies. We'll check to see that you are a web project, that you're inheriting from a Spring Boot application. If you have any Java files, we'll compile them. If you have any tests, we'll run the test, and we'll compile this into a new directory that wasn't there before, the target directory, right there. Okay. Under the target directory, there's a couple of things that were generated for you. One of them in particular is this jar file that says snapshot.jar. Okay? And that's all you need, right? That's the jar file that contains the entire application packaged into one single file, right? A jar file is nothing than just a zip file, right? That has changed the extension to jar instead. Okay. All right. So if you look at the project, we can see that there's only one Java file in here of interest. Okay. Notice there it is. That's the only Java file in here, and it's not much, right? It's not much. It's just it has a main. Right, which means that this is where the application starts, right? And it just says, okay, well, there's a demo application class, run it, Spring application.run, right? And that's it. That's all it is, right? Right now, it's a web application. This starts up the web server and listens by default at port 8080. You can change the port, and it by default it just hosts. All the content inside of web app. Okay, so we can run that. Let's see, we did that. We can run it by just using Java jar. So Java jar from the command line. Java jar. This means run whatever is in this jar file, right? And it will look for the class that has the main function, right? And or method, right? And it'll start that main function in there. So where is it? It's in the target, and we have it'll be a jar for it's that one. All right, so it starts up. All right, so Tomcat has started. Right, it has by default it uses Tomcat as the web server, and it's listening at port 8080. Right, so we can now we can hit that port. You can say localhost 8080 and ask for our index file that we created. Right, and it has the welcome to webdev summer 2018. Right. Again, the root of your application, of your web application, is that web app directory, right? That's the default name. You can change the name, but that's the default. Right? Another common name is public or home or whatever, right? Everybody okay? All right. So notice that here I gave the index file explicitly. Now the index file is a standard name. Index.html is a standard name. It's a default file, right? If you don't ask for any particular file, if I don't specify index.html and I only specify some context, right? It'll look to see if there is an index file. If there is, that's the file you're going to get, right? So it's implicit, right? There. So we have our index file. Any questions so far? All right, awesome. Okay, so let's see. We want to make sure that we can deploy this on Heroku. All right, so let's work on that next. First, we'll need to make sure that this is a Git repository. All right, the way Heroku works is that it deploys your source code to a repository, a code repository. Whether Heroku has its own repository or you can have your own repository. Okay, we're going to have both. Okay? And whether you have one or the other, Heroku will read from that repository and deploy whatever it sees on that repository. Okay? So let's create a brand new repository. I'm going to stop the server. Well, I'll leave it running. We can start a new tab. We're in the same directory, I think. Yes. Okay. So we're going to start. We're going to create a brand new repository. Notice that this already has a couple of things that are related to Git. Notice that it has a .gitignore already. See that? Okay, that's very important. That is a list of files you do not want to put in the repository. Okay? Like, for instance, if you have any compiled classes, you don't want that in your repository. Any jar files that can be reconstructed later, you don't want that either in the repository. Right? So I do not, the TAs and myself are going to make sure that you do not have any of that in your repository. Okay? But that's great because the gitignore already has listed. If you do a more gitignore, notice that it lists here. I don't want any class path, and anything under .project, anything under the directory .settings, .idea. That's all IntelliJ related files. I don't want that either. Anything that goes in the build directory, I don't want that either. Anything under target, right? I don't want that either. Any jar compiled classes or compiled jar files. Right, so the gitignore is used to manage the things you do not want to put into the repository. Make sense? All right. So the Spring Boot CLI was nice enough to create one for us. Okay, but if it wasn't there, make sure to put one there. Always make sure that it's in there. All right. Let's see. What else? It has a gitignore, but it's not a repository yet. Okay, it's not a repository yet, but it pre-created for us the gitignore. Which is great. So to make this a Git repository, we're going to do a git init. And it just initialized a brand new repository. And the only thing that it did is that it created a new folder. Notice the .git, right? It's a hidden folder, right? That's now there. And in there is where Git is going to do all its magic, right? It's going to keep track of all the history, right, of all the changes of our source code. Okay. So don't blow that away. Make sure that stays. And now we're going to add all our content, right? So we're gonna add all our source code. So we're going to do a git add. In this case, it was just the POM file we want in there. Anything under source we want in there. So it's our index files there, right? Our web app directory is there. And we're going to do our first commit. So we'll do git commit. Our first commit, and it's telling us what is it that it committed. It added the gitignore, which is great. I guess the Maven wrapper was added in there. Maven CMD POM file is there. Our main file is there. The Java entry point is there. The index file is in there, and any test. We don't have any tests, but it added that as well. Okay. All right, so we're done. Let's presumably we have already installed the Heroku CLI. All right. So let's log in. And I think I had already. All right, so I'm logged in. So the next command would be to create the application, and you do that again with Heroku Create. And Heroku Create is smart enough to figure out what type of application it is, right? If it sees that it has a JavaScript, it has Node.js dependencies, whatnot, it'll say, this is a Node.js server that you need, okay? If it sees a POM file and it sees some Java dependencies, it figures out that this is a Java project. So it creates the correct project for you, right? Most of the times, right? Sometimes you need to go in and tweak it, and tell it exactly what type of project it is, but most of the time it gets it right. It also creates for you a default name, a random name for your application where this is going to be deployed. In this case, it chose Peaceful Forest, 10473 Heroku.com. Okay, It also created for us in its own repository, it has its own code repository at git.heroku.com peacefulforest.git. All right, so that's where our source code is going to live. All right. And now we're ready to push. Right. Notice that it also created. Let's see, Git remote. Notice that it also created for us an entry in our Git repository, in our Git configuration. It declared a remote. It says there is a remote repository called Heroku, right, that points to this URL. Okay, so that if you push your source code to this remote repository, it will deploy. Right? It will compile, it will package, and deploy your code from that repository. Right? All right. Notice that it did not create an origin. You see that? Right, an origin is the default repository, right? Because you might want to point your default repository elsewhere. Right? Maybe you want to point it to your own repository on GitHub.com. Right? Maybe you want to point it elsewhere. So it was nice, and it says, okay, I'll create my own repository and point it to the Heroku repository, but I won't mock with the origin, the default repository. Right? So if we want to push to Heroku, we can say Git Push. Git Push Heroku, and we're going to push the master branch. Let's make sure that we're on the we are on the master branch. Indeed, we are. Right, on default, you are on the master branch. All this work we should have done in a feature branch and then merged it, but I got lazy here. So let's push this. So we can say Git Push. If you say Git Push all by itself, it'll try to push to the default remote repository, right? But we don't have one, right? Instead, we have the Heroku one. So we'll explicitly say that we want to push to the Heroku repository, and we're also going to specify which branch do we want to push. We want to push the master branch. Okay. So this pushes to the remote Heroku repository. So it's copying all our content to the remote repository. It's compiling. It's looking at our POM file, and it sees all our dependencies and says, "Ooh, you have all these dependencies." It's downloading them, right, remotely to their server, not ours. And it's downloading all that. It builds, and now it says, "Okay, I'm discovering that the build pack. It's a web." It identified this as a web application, and it's launching the application. Basically, it's doing java-jar, the jar file that it compiled, but remotely on the remote server, and presumably it's up and running. Okay, we can type Heroku open, or we can navigate to the URL. That's the same. But so this, if you say Heroku open, it says, okay, well, I know where I deployed it, right? So I'll open it for you. But basically, it's peaceful-forest10473.heroku.com. It's still loading. It's maybe spinning up the server still. So these are all free servers, right? So they'll go to sleep after you haven't used it for a while, right? So this is very common. That if you haven't used it for a couple of days, right, it'll go to sleep, and it'll take a while to boot up again. I don't know if it takes that long. Yes, no, yes. All right, while that is going, let's give it a minute. This will have deployed, presumably. You can take a look at the logs as well. You can look at the remote logs, see if there's anything wrong, right? If there's anything wrong happening on the remote server. So you can type in Heroku. Oh, wait, did I copy? Did I copy? I thought I copied. Copy. And it says that it builds. Notice that it keeps a log of what's going on the remote server. This is a great debugging tool, right? As if you compile something and you just made a change, right? This is you should leave this window open all the time, right? And keep a log every time you deploy, you redeploy, right? It might work locally. Make sure that you are at the end of the day, once you've done a lot of deployment, a lot of work, you commit, you deploy remotely, making sure that you haven't broken anything. All right, so notice that it changed the start from starting to down. Oh no. So Peaceful Forest died. So it's not so peaceful. All right, I'll take a look at what's going on there a little later. Let's see, what else? We can rename the application by using Heroku apps :rename, right? And then you can give it a brand new name. So if remotely it chose Peaceful Forest, but indeed you want to change it to something else, something more relevant to our course. For instance, you could say, CS whatever summer to 2018, and then your username. It will append to it Heroku.com or HerokuApp.com, right? Because it's in their domain. What else? Oh yeah, this is just to point out that the fact that let me start a new one. Inside of Git, you can look at the configuration. Notice that it had declared an entry point called Heroku, right? A remote Heroku that points to the Peaceful Forest Git repository. And you can create your own, right? To point maybe to GitHub.com instead, right? That's how you're going to be submitting your work, right? So let's import. Okay, we did this, right? We imported this. Next step. Okay, so next step might be to connect this to a database, right? To a local running database, or even a remote database. All right. So let's work on that next.